Hi, this is Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek. This is going to be a short video to support my claim last year that the movie American Gospel Christ Alone is in fact coming from a Calvinist perspective. Shortly after I did my rebuttal video in July of 2019, the movie's director Brandon Kimber was discussing it with Melissa Doherty. Here's how that exchange went.
You do hold to Reformed theology.
Correct.
Yes. So a lot of people are wondering if it's, a form of Calvinist propaganda, or if that's just something that you're trying to push in the documentary is Reformed theology. I personally didn't see that, being somebody who doesn't necessarily hold to Reformed theology. I'm rather agnostic about it. I did not pick up on that at all personally, but I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
People do say this is Calvinist cessationist propaganda. I'm like, you haven't watched the film.
I don't get how people can get that from this film. The only thing I can think of is that virtually all the people who would say that are hyper charismatic.
So Melissa thinks only a hyper-charismatic would see it as promoting Calvinism. And Brandon's response was that people who say that haven't watched the movie. Well, over the past year, several other YouTubers have watched the movie and have made similar observations. So let's hear what they have to say. We'll start with somebody who isn't a charismatic. This guy is J.C. Pilcher. He has a small Reformed apologetics channel. So you wouldn't consider him a hyper-charismatic or even a nominal charismatic. He sees the movie as Reformed or Calvinist, and he's cool with that.
Here's just a few of the people that I saw that I recognized right off the bat. We had Paul Washer, Ray Comfort, Steve Lawson, Michael Horton, Justin Peters, Costi Hinn, Phil Johnson, John MacArthur, Chris Roseborough, R. Scott Clark, J.D. Greer, Matt Chandler, and Jackie Hill Perry. Now, most of those guys, they are A-plus preachers and theologians. I would be like, I recommend you guys checking out their stuff. I do it without having to disclaimer they think this weird thing or they think that weird thing. Certainly, I don't agree with all of them on everything they've ever said. I don't think there's any two people in the world who agree 100% on anything, but I can recommend the vast majority of everything that these people have said.
So he clearly sees it as leaning Calvinist because the long list of names he stated were all Calvinists except for Chris Roseborough, who's Lutheran, and possibly Ray Comfort, who seems to enjoy hanging out with Calvinists, even though he claims he's not a Calvinist. And this next guy is Martin Kilian from South Africa.
Their main premise was to name and shame those whom they regard by their own decision to be false teachers. And to be honest, there is false teaching in every sector of the church, in every denomination, in every avenue. There is teaching that needs to be debunked. Even from those who make this documentary, from Reformed Calvinist theology, there is many false teachings in Reformed and Calvinist theology that needs to be debunked. And the way that we do this is not by throwing stones and naming names. It is by building bridges, building relationship, and doing church, reading scripture, and doing community together with other believers.
So Martin also sees it as Reformed or Calvinist. So let's get the thoughts of a guy with a bit larger channel. This guy is known as Stephen of North.
So in that sense, we get the understanding from watching this movie that clearly there's one point of view that is speaking. And that point of view is clearly rooted in the hyper-conservative Calvinistic movement, which puts a lot of faith in an intellectually oriented church. And it stems from the Reformation, specifically from Martin Luther and John Calvin. But I could probably say, based on all of the voices and the opinions that are supported and displayed as being more positive in this movie, are Calvinist voices, are people that align themselves with Calvinism. And that's interesting. And it's also an issue because it's very one-sided and it presupposes that Calvinism is in fact correct.
Now, to be fair, Martin and Stephen are charismatic, but I don't know that you would consider them hyper-charismatic. And neither one of them is exactly a household name either. So let's now get the thoughts of a non-charismatic who is better known in the YouTube world, Dr. Layton Flowers. Layton is an adjunct professor for Trinity Seminary and is the director of evangelism and apologetics for Texas Baptists since 2018, and has a website and YouTube channel dedicated to refuting Calvinism called Soteriology 101. Here's what he had to say about American Gospel, Christ Alone.
I liked and resonated with a lot of what this video was all about, and so I didn't want to look like I was just completely disregarding what the American Gospel portrayal is, because then it would be taken as, oh, well, Layton's a prosperity gospel then. And that's part of the false dilemma that I want to address in my review. This false dichotomy, or this kind of pendulum issue, this one side or the other kind of perspective that I really want to address about this video, that I see kind of in the undertones of it. And that's really what I want to focus on. But for those of you who are new to this broadcast, just know, overall, I like the film. If you're not really familiar with the theological differences between what Calvinism claims and what other Christians claim, then you're probably not going to be much interested in anything else that I have to say. So you can stop the video if you'd like, or you can stay on and learn a little bit more about what we are concerned with regard to the purity of the Scriptures in regard to God's character and love and provision for every single person. Because what the directors of this particular program, the American Gospel, believe is a doctrine called Calvinism, something that we as provisionist and traditional Southern Baptist, many Wesleyan Arminians, Methodist types, and others would disagree with from the Calvinistic vantage point. Because Calvinists believe that God, before the foundation of the world, selected a certain group of people, a particular number of people, for reasons that we don't know. He just picked out some people, and he's going to change their hearts to make them believe. And everyone else is ultimately born a reprobate or a non-elect person, and they have no hope of salvation.
So clearly he isn't hyper-charismatic or word of faith, and doesn't condone the so-called prosperity gospel, but he also recognizes the Calvinist slant of the film. And finally, Mike Winger, one of the most popular Bible teachers on YouTube, who was actually in the sequel movie called American Gospel, Christ Crucified.
That some people were asking about the American Gospel movie, and I'll mention that. So American Gospel has 2 films out, the first and the second one, and I'm in the second one, but I liked the first one better. So they're both actually really valuable and totally worth watching. The first one and second one both deal with these kind of progressive, total distortions of Christianity. And not just people who disagree on minor things, but actual radical, dangerous, and heretical distortions of the truth of Christianity. They're those who use the name of Christ to lead people away from Christ is what ultimately comes down to. Both those videos tackle those things and go into that. And I think you have to watch it, though, knowing that if that's the target, it's perfectly good job well done. But you also should know that the videos, most of the people participating are Calvinists, and they're not only going to teach you, to come off the cliff of this progressive or prosperity preaching stuff, but they're also going to be trying to make the safe ground look like Calvinism. And I'm not a Calvinist. That's actually one of the reasons why I was in the second video, is to try to round things out a little bit by having a non-Calvinist. But the second video is actually more strongly Calvinist than the first. So you have to have this awareness as you're watching the content.
So Mike also admits the Calvinist undertones, and even says that they wanted him in the sequel as a kind of a token non-Calvinist to give them more credibility. Is Mike a hyper-charismatic, Melissa? I mean, you've done several videos with him, so it would seem to me that you consider him to be pretty credible. Now, I'm not saying that I was the first one to call American Gospel on its Reformed perspective, but I don't think anybody was more vocal about it than I was. And even though I was maligned for speaking out, a year later, I feel totally vindicated. If you've watched American Gospel Christ Alone, or are planning on watching it, you need to be aware of the fact that this Calvinist emphasis is there. Whether you call it propaganda, as I did, or Calvinist undertones, as Leighton Flowers did, or largely Calvinist, as Mike Winger did, a consensus is emerging that most of the people involved in the project are Calvinists, and they're presenting Calvinism as the safe alternative to progressive theology and word of faith teaching.
You haven't watched the film.
Oh, we watched it, Brandon. Only we watched it with eyes wide open, and we saw what you were doing. It was a nice try, but the jig's up. You're busted.